Hare Krishna. Welcome to everybody that's out there on Zoom, as well as those joining us on Facebook, on YouTube, the Philadelphia Iskcon YouTube channel. Welcome. Tonight, we're celebrating the appearance day of one of the great acharyas, one of the Six Goswamis, Srila Jiva Goswami. And we have with us notable scholars that we have, I believe. One, Srila Jiva Goswami, His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu. For those of you who have not yet met Radhika Raman Prabhu, he has his doctorate from Oxford University in Hindu Religious Studies, specialization of Srila Jiva Goswami's Vedanta. He's taught at the University of Florida, Centre College, William and Mary, and he currently holds the Charles Reid Chair of Religious Studies at Utah State University. He's a faculty member of the Bhaktivedanta College, and in 2008, he was selected to meet with Pope Benedict and present him with a gift of the Bhagavad Gita on behalf of the Hindu American community. Back in, as Krishna Kirtan just mentioned, back in, I think it was November, we had Radhika Raman Prabhu was giving a class at New Vrindavan to the GBC College. And he gave a class on Goswami and Srila Jiva Goswami's contribution to our Vaishnava lineage. And at the time I thought, this is really powerful stuff. I mean, this is things that all devotees should really get a chance to hear and learn about. And when I saw Srila Jiva Goswami's appearance date coming on the calendar, I thought this is a wonderful opportunity to have the community of devotees hear about and glorify Srila Jiva Goswami. Now, Radhika Raman Prabhu is extremely busy. I reached out to him and he got back to me very graciously. He explained that he's currently working on a deadline for a book for the Oxford University Press. And unfortunately, he hasn't been able to do a lot of classes. But because we were doing something on Srila Jiva Goswami, he wanted to reciprocate and be with us tonight. So it is a great honor, that we can welcome and hear from Radhika Raman Prabhu. So Radhika Raman Prabhu, thank you again so very, very much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much, Dronacharya Prabhu, for that very kind introduction. It's so good to see you and to see so many other friends here on the call. Yeah, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to glorify Srila Jiva Goswami. Any chance that I can get, I like to take to speak about him, because as Prabhu mentioned in the introduction, I did my PhD work on Srila Jiva Goswami, and so I spent many years studying about him and writing about him, and really have a lot of gratitude for Srila Jiva Goswami and what he's done for our movement and for our sampradaya. So thank you for inviting me this evening, and I wanted to just begin with singing a couple of prayers to the Six Goswamis. I think it's an appropriate way to start. So I'm going to share my screen in case let's see.
You're good. I made you a co-host, so you should be able to open that up.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So singing responsively on Zoom is kind of terrible, and so what I'll do is I'll just sing it through, and we're also short on time. So I'll sing a few of the verses of the Six Goswami Ashtaka. These are the prayers to the Six Goswamis by Srinivasa Acharya, and then we'll begin with the talk. Krishna Kirtana Gana Nartana Paro Premamritam Bho Nidhi Dhira dhira jana priyo priyakaro nirmatsaro pujito Shri Chaitanya Kripa Bharo Bhuvi Bhuvo Bharavahantarako Vande Rupa Sanatano Raghuyugo Shri Jiva Gopalako Nana Shastra Vicharanaika Nipuno Sadharma Samstapako Lokanam Hitakarino Tribhuvane Manyo Sharan Yakaro Radha Krishna Padaravind Bhajana Nandena Mattaliko Vande Rupa Sanatano Raghuyugo Shri Jiva Gopalako Tyaktva Turnamasheshaman Dalapati Shrenim Sadatu Chava Bhutva Dina Ganeshako Naya Gopina Kanthashito Gopi Bhavara Samrita Tilahari Kallola Magno Moho Vande Rupa Sanatano Raghuyugo Shri Jiva Gopalako He Radhe Braja Devike Chalalite He Nanda Suno Kota Shri Govardhana Kalpa Padapatale Kalindi Vanye Kota Shantaviti Sarvato Prajapure Khidair Mahavifalo Vande Rupa Sanatano Raghuyugo Shri Jiva Gopalako Om Jnanatimirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaurvani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschat Deshatarine. Okay. Adronacharya Prabhu, I don't know if it's possible as host to mute everyone by default, whether that works.
Yes, I'll do that, Prabhu.
Okay, thank you. Today is Srila Jiva Goswami's appearance day, and there's a conversation where Srila Prabhupada says that on the occasion of Srila Jiva Goswami's appearance, we should gather together to glorify his life and activities and study his 6 sandarbhas. So it won't be possible today to study the 6 sandarbhas because they're quite detailed and elaborate, although I'll give a few pointers at the end. But at the very least, we can glorify Srila Jiva Goswami's life and activities. And this is very much the day to do so because it's his appearance day. Actually, Srila Jiva Goswami was very dear to Srila Prabhupada, as was Jiva Goswami's temple, his deities, Shri Radha Damodar and the Radha Damodar temple. As I think many people on this call will know, Srila Prabhupada spent many years of his life in Shri Radha Damodar temple in a couple of rooms, which he called his eternal residence. And before he came to the United States. And there he translated the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam and gathered so much determination and spiritual strength and mercy to come to the West and give us the special gift that he gave us. And so he writes about the Srila Jiva Goswami in the Radha Damodar temple in when he returns, when he comes to the United States. One of these, he says, "My mission is to develop the glories of Srila Jiva Goswami all over the world, and I think you should cooperate with my mission." In another place, he says, "Srila Jiva Goswami's temple is my heart and soul. If Shri Radha Damodar desire, one day the glories of the Radha Damodar temple will be spread everywhere, and people from all over the world will come to visit." And of course, the fact that Srila Prabhupada spent his time at Radha Damodar temple is no coincidence. Hopefully, this will become clear in the course of our talk today. So, what to say about Jiva Goswami? There's actually so much we can say and so much we can describe. He's famous as the highest exemplar of scholarship used in the service of Lord Krishna. And you see, already in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's a wonderful story where we see this need come to the fore. It is said, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami describes that when Lord Chaitanya, he traveled all over India, everywhere he went, he brought a flood of love of God to that location. Everyone he met was overcome by this bhakti. It was contagious, and when they would meet someone else, they would infect that other person with this bhakti as well. And it became really of epidemic proportions, to use a metaphor that is perhaps not so nice today. But it became something really wonderful, and it became a flood. That's the metaphor that Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami uses, like little rivulets coming together of water, and they develop into something very large and powerful and unstoppable. And yet, Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says that there was one place in India that that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu did not seem to have the effect that he had in other places. And this place was Benares, Kashi, or Varanasi. And the reason for that was because this Benares was overrun by people who were by sannyasis and scholars who were impersonalists, Mayavadis, and those who didn't accept the reality of Krishna's personal form and his activities and his devotees. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says that I have come to Varanasi carrying these heavy loads of bhakti, of prema bhakti, and I will have to take them back because there are no buyers here. He even offers to give them away for free, but there are no takers of this wonderful gift. And so Mahaprabhu is not all that disturbed because he's blissful in Krishna Kirtan and chanting Krishna's holy names. But his followers, Shankaracharya and Tapan Mishra, they are not so happy with the criticism that Mahaprabhu is getting. And so they request the Lord to please meet with the sannyasis who are, the cause of this resistance to bhakti, and change their heart. And Mahaprabhu, out of compassion for his devotees, says, sure, I'll do that. Please arrange a meeting. And at this meeting, Prakashananda Saraswati, who's quite famous as an author and sannyasi, along with his 1,000 sannyasi disciples, they all come, they assemble together. And in the course of that meeting, Mahaprabhu changes their heart and their mind. Give me just 1 second. The sun is setting here, so it's coming in my eyes a little bit. I gotta change the blinds. I think on the East Coast it's probably already dark or close to dark, but here in Utah we still have some sunlight. So Mahaprabhu, he changes their heart, and in three different ways. He takes, first of all, by his humility. When he enters, he sits down in the doorway where the shoes are kept, in an unclean place. And they're all surprised because he's also a sannyasi and very respectable. But he says, no, I'm not qualified to sit with all of you. You are very learned and I'm just a fool. And so by his humility, he also tells them that I don't know anything about Vedanta, which is not true. But he says, I don't know anything about Vedanta. My guru considered me a fool. And so he said, just chant Hare Krishna. So this type of humility is very charming to them and endearing. And so they're immediately softened, right? Imagine someone coming in for a big debate and you're expecting an argument where, I mean, I'm sure we've all been in such meetings before where you go to the meeting expecting a fight, expecting resistance. And imagine if the other side just completely humbles themselves before you. Any resistance, any desire to fight that you might have is going to completely melt away, right? And the conversation, although it might still be an argument, will be much sweeter and much nicer. So Mahaprabhu teaches us something very nice about how we ought to engage in discussions, especially with those who are very learned or who consider themselves very learned. The second thing is Mahaprabhu charms them by his beauty, by his effulgence. And although this is something that we may not have too much of ourselves in terms of Brahman effulgence, but at least we can try to have purity. And when there's purity of heart and character, then that too is very attractive in the nature of devotees. And many people comment about when they see devotees of Krishna, they always seem so bright-faced and so happy and so brilliant. So it's a reality. It's something that, you know, we don't have the tejas, the potency of Mahaprabhu, of course, not even close. But that little bit, you know, we can experience that purity is attractive. And when people see the face of a devotee and the happiness there, they become very attracted by that. And the third and final thing that Mahaprabhu used was, of course, his philosophical acumen, his ability to reason and argument and debate. And that takes up the bulk of the discussion where Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami describes the back and forth discussion that they had and the various arguments about Vedanta philosophy that Mahaprabhu gave. And in this way, he changed the hearts of the Mayavadi sannyasis and turned the tide for the movement in Benares, in Varanasi. So Mahaprabhu did this, right? He dealt with a criticism made by these people in Benares. What was the criticism? Basically, Prakashananda Saraswati was saying that, you know, there's nothing wrong per se with Krishna bhakti or even with chanting. It's just, why do you hang out with these sentimentalists? It's so embarrassing to see a sannyasi, one of us, be there with these sentimentalist devotees, these bhaktas, bhavukas, he calls them, which means emotionalists, sentimentalists, people who don't have much philosophical substance. And this argument should not come as a surprise to any of us. For anyone who's joined the movement, they've heard before, perhaps from family members, perhaps from friends, that it's, why do you all, it's nice you do bhakti, but why do you all distribute books on the street? Why do you dance up and down? It's so embarrassing. Why not behave like a gentleman and become learned and scholarly and so on? And this kind of criticism has been true about bhakti all the way from the start of Mahaprabhu's movement. We can see every generation has made this criticism with the assumption that if you are devotional, then you cannot be intellectual, right? This is the dichotomy that people have to this day all over the world, in India, in the West. that if you are devotional, if you have emotion, then you cannot be intellectual, that you cannot be philosophical. When I was first starting my PhD at Oxford, at that point I was trying to figure out what topic I should do my PhD on. And one of the things that I noticed, which always irritated me, was how whenever you read textbooks that describe the history of Hinduism, then they always describe the philosophers of India in great detail, like Ramanuja Charya and Madhvacharya, Shankaracharya, Swami Vivekananda in the modern period. But Mahaprabhu or his followers are never in that list. Rather, you find Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu listed amongst the saints of India. And he's always described as the one who was, he's always described as someone who is emotional and very, devotional and brought a wave of bhakti throughout India. But he's not described as someone who founded and who provided such a major philosophical tradition known as Achintya Bheda. And he's never counted amongst India's philosophers. And so we see that the same attitude, the same criticism continues even to the present day in academic work and in popular circles as well. So this was the so this concern has always been there, and Mahaprabhu dealt with it in his time. But how were we to lay this to rest for future generations as well? This was the question, because if every generation is going to bring up this criticism, this idea, this misconception about bhakti and about Mahaprabhu's movement in particular, then how is it to be laid to rest? In fact, many of these textbooks, they describe Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as an epileptic, someone who had seizures all the time and therefore couldn't control his behavior. And some scholars even describe him as kind of stumbling his way through India in this ecstatic fits, not really knowing what was happening and how things were going. So very, very terrible misconceptions. Not everyone thinks like this, but some do, right? And it's actually not all that different from the criticisms that Prakashananda Saraswati gave in that time. If you read his words, it's dripping with the same sort of, sarcasm about the emotional side of bhakti. So what to do about this into the future? And this is where Srila Jiva Goswami becomes so important, so crucial, because Srila Jiva Goswami is the one who establishes for the first time in our movement a very, very sound and very stable philosophical foundation that generations to come can use and adapt and deploy for the challenges of their own time. In his 6 Sandarbhas, in the Shat Sandarbha, which is Jiva Goswami's philosophical magnum opus, in those 6 Sandarbhas, Jiva Goswami provides a comprehensive and systematic argument for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy, beginning from the very basics of Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, the importance of a personal Godhead, going all the way to the highest reaches of Prema Bhakti. He gives the full range, the full spectrum in the Sandarbhas. And each time he writes about one of these topics, it's very interesting. Jiva Goswami does not assume until the later Sandarbhas. In the first 3 or 4 Sandarbhas, Jiva Goswami does not assume that his readers already have faith in Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu or even in Krishna. He starts in a place where kind of a generic place of faith that would have been acceptable to any intellectual of his time, right? So in other words, he begins with he assumes that the reader accepts the authority, the validity of the Vedas and the Upanishads, and maybe a little bit of the Puranas, but still not the Bhagavatam. He assumes that they basically accept the reality of the various devas, the different deities, like Lord Vishnu and Lord Shiva and Lord Brahma and so on, but not yet the idea that Krishna is supreme. He assumes that they understand something about rasa, about this aesthetic emotion, but not that bhakti is the highest rasa. So he assumes kind of a generic philosophical basis that would have been common in India at that time. But he takes that and then on that basis builds the foundation for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy, and creates and provides a wonderful overview and exposition and a foundation to prove the supremacy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy, right? So it's a very nice example in the sense that he begins with what is acceptable, generally acceptable in his time, which is exactly what anyone who is presenting Krishna consciousness for the wider world should do. It's something that we should do, is we should provide, we should start from where people are at. What is the generally acceptable attitude towards faith in our time? How do people think of religion and how do they think of God? And from that, we guide them to Lord Chaitanya's philosophy. We guide them to where we want to be in terms of love for Krishna Bhakti. So this is Jiva Goswami's special contribution. I mean, there's so many contributions, as we'll see. But to start off with, he's really fulfilling this need. In fact, what's so amazing about the whole scenario is that Jiva Goswami himself returns to Benares, the same place where Mahaprabhu was not appreciated initially. Jiva Goswami returns to that place as a young man. And for 1 year, which for someone as brilliant as Jiva Goswami is quite a long time, although it's short for us. In 1 year, he learns the 6 darshanas, 6 systems of philosophy, including those systems that are opposed to the Vaishnava thesis. And after learning them systematically and very thoroughly, we know this because he uses this in his writing. We know he studied these thoroughly because he quotes in his writings not just from the Vaishnavacharyas, not just from his seniors like Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Goswami, but he quotes from a wide range of different texts. Even Shankaracharya, for example, whose ideas of impersonalism are opposed to the Vaishnava thesis. So he quotes all of these, he's clearly studied them in great depth, right? So he goes to that center of learning, learns the very arguments and ideas that were being used against the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, starting from the time of Mahaprabhu himself, and then goes to Vrindavan to write his books, and in many cases argue against what he had learned, right? So he shows a very nice example for how one can use education, even education that is not necessarily in sync with Vaishnava Siddhanta, but how one can use it, study it, understand it very thoroughly, and use it nicely in the Lord's service. So I tell that story from Chaitanya Charitamrita to show how Jiva Goswami is fulfilling that need, that purpose that is expressed by Mahaprabhu himself, by becoming the exemplar of what it means to use scholarship, to use learning in the service of the Lord, in the service of bhakti. Now, some basics. I think many of you will know, but Srila Jiva Goswami was the nephew of Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Goswami. the senior most of the six Goswamis. His father was their brother. His father's name was Anupam Goswami. And Anupam Goswami was actually present when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu instructed Srila Rupa Goswami. But he passed away soon thereafter, it is said, on their way back to Bengal. So Jiva Goswami lost his father very early on. And it is said by some authors that this created a great sense of renunciation and detachment from the world in him. He was at the age of 12, or some say 24. We know very little about Jiva Goswami's earlier life. And the reason for that is because all the major biographies written by our acharyas in that early period were biographies of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And Srila Jiva Goswami lived in the generation after Mahaprabhu, right? So he was the nephew of Rupa and Sanatan Goswami. Rupa and Sanatan were such close associates, dear associates of Mahaprabhu. But Jiva Goswami was a child when Mahaprabhu was there, or even not even born, according to some authors. So we know very little, because what we know about the Goswamis was written in biographies of Mahaprabhu, and Jiva Goswami didn't have a direct role to play in Mahaprabhu's life. And so we can piece together from later books such as Bhakti Ratnakara or other biographies of Vaishnavacharyas, and some things match and some things don't, but we have a basic outline of his life and his story. So at the age of 24 or so, he left home and decided to join his uncles, Rupa and Sanatan, in Vrindavan. But along the way, he stopped in Navadvip to visit the places of Mahaprabhu's Leela, his pastimes. And Nityananda Prabhu himself was the tour guide, as Jiva Goswami did the Navadvip Mandal Parikrama, and showed him all the places and introduced him to many of the associates of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And with those great blessings of Nityananda Prabhu, he sent Jiva to Vrindavan. Now, this is, of course, one of Nityananda Prabhu's roles is to send devotees to Vrindavan. We know he did this also with Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in a dream, and sent him to, he said, go to Vrindavan where all things shall come to pass. So Jiva Goswami went to Vrindavan. Well, first he went to Benares and he studied there, as I had mentioned. And after a year in Benares, where he very, very quickly mastered, at great speed, he mastered what was to be learned. He then joined his uncles in Vrindavan. And we read that when he got there, Jiva Goswami engaged in menial service for the Vaishnavas there, especially for Rupa Goswami and Sanatan Goswami. He would do things like fanning them in the summer heat while they wrote the Vaishnava Shastras. He would prepare the palm leaves or the bark or the paper upon which they wrote. This was something that was quite laborsome and had to be done individually for each sheet of paper or bark or palm leaf upon which they were writing. So he would get those things ready. He would clean after them. So in this way, he very quickly endeared himself to all the Vaishnavas in Vrindavan. They loved him very, very much as a result of his humility, as a result of his attitude of service, and of course, as a result of his brilliance, which was visible very early on. In fact, very soon after his arrival, Jiva Goswami began assisting Rupa Goswami, not just in the ways that I described, but also in the writing and editing of his books. So Jiva Goswami played a role in editing the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Nectar of Devotion, before it was given out to the world. And he also wrote the first commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu called Durgama Sangamani. So imagine how closely the Goswamis held, how closely Jiva Goswami held the senior Goswamis' trust. If any of you have written a book or written essay or article, you know that when you produce something after great thought and care, then to get to have someone else edit it, you have to have a lot of trust in that person. It's like tampering with your own creation, something that has taken so much time, and you don't want anyone to touch it. And anything they do, you look at very carefully to make sure they haven't changed anything incorrectly. So, I mean to say, we can see how much they trusted Jiva Goswami and how much they loved him. In fact, Srila Prabhupada describes that the six Goswamis would gather every evening in the Radha Damodar temple, Srila Jiva Goswami's temple. And there, Srila Prabhupada says,
you should order some prasadam for Annie tomorrow.
He would plot the, Prabhupada says, the six Goswamis in the Radha Damodar temple, they would gather and plot the worldwide expansion of the Krishna consciousness movement. Right? So it was, and therefore Prabhupada says that this Radha Damodar temple is the spiritual center of our Krishna consciousness movement. That is where it all began, both in his life, of course, but also going back to the time of the six Goswamis. That's where the planning, that's where the gathering. They loved him so much, and they so much wanted to empower the younger generation. Right? Jiva Goswami, remember, he was what we would call today the second generation, born into the movement. Right? So the older Goswamis had come to the movement by meeting Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but he was born into a family of devotees. He was the second generation. They knew that they were entrusting this movement into his hands, and they so much loved him and wanted to empower him that they made the Radha Damodar temple the hub of their activities. That's where they would gather. Also, the Goswamis, including Raghunath Das Goswami and Rupa Goswami and Sanatan Goswami, when they left this world, they gave their personal libraries and all their belongings, everything they had to their name, to Jiva Goswami. So they entrusted him with the future. In fact, Raghunath Das Goswami left a will in which he writes that that everything I own, which was nothing at all, it was very little, but he had a little plot of land next to the Radha Kunda, and he said, "I leave this to and as well as his deities, I leave this to Sri Jiva Goswami." So the library of the Radha Damodar temple was the best library in all of Braj, and one of the finest Vaishnav libraries, Gaudiya Vaishnav libraries that we have. That library today, so it was in the Radha Damodar temple for centuries, and then today it is now housed, in the Vrindavan Research Institute, just down the road from the Krishna Balaram temple. And many of the old manuscripts they have there, you can see a stamp on them still that says from the Radha Damodar temple library. And they are copies of works that were written or collected by the Goswamis of Vrindavan. Sometimes a single copy down, or sometimes two copies down. And in a couple instances, we have single pages or a few pages of the original writing of Srila Rupa Goswami. That's on display at the Vrindavan Research Institute. So in this way, Jiva Goswami was really the heart of the Vaishnav community there in Vrindavan. Now, Jiva Goswami is most famous for his prodigious pen. He wrote so much. It's actually difficult to wrap our heads around. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, the Srimad Bhagavatam is 18,000 verses long, right? And we all know how long that is, how much effort and time it takes to get through it. The Mahabharata is the longest book in the world, longest epic story, and it's 100,000 verses long. There are very few people I know who have actually read the entire Mahabharata. Most people know the story of the Mahabharata from the TV serial. But people who have actually read the book, there's stories in there that practically none of us know. There's so much there. There's a saying that says that if it's not, if anything exists, it's in the Mahabharata. And if it's not in the Mahabharata, it doesn't exist. So it's a huge work of 100,000 verses. Jiva Goswami on his own wrote 400,000 verses. Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami estimates the size of his writings to be 400,000 verses. You can imagine just how large that is. It's massive. And not only did he write so much, but he was very versatile in the types of things that he wrote. Most people, if they're poets, they write poetry. And if they're philosophers, they write philosophy. And philosophers typically don't write poetry, and poets don't write philosophy. People stick to one type, one genre of writing. But what makes Jiva Goswami's 400,000 verses so impressive is that not only did he write a lot, but he wrote a lot of different kinds of things. Jan Brzezinski, he received his PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies in University of London on Srila Jiva Goswami's Gopal Champu. And in his dissertation, he divides the body of literature that Jiva Goswami wrote into 4 different categories. One is philosophical works. Okay, so Jiva Goswami wrote works of philosophy, the most famous of which is, of course, the Shat Sandarbha. I've already described to you its importance. These are 6 treatises on bhakti, beginning with Tattva Sandarbha, Bhagavat Sandarbha, Paramatma, like that, working its way through our philosophy. So he wrote many philosophical works. The second category is he wrote works of literature, so literary poetic works. And the most famous of these is Gopal Champu. Jiva Goswami wrote this in his later years, and it's a marvel of literature, of poetry. Basically, a champu in Sanskrit is a type of writing which is a combination of prose and poetry. Okay, just like Bhagavad Gita is all poetry, and the Sandarbhas is all prose, except for the quotations he has from Gita and Bhagavatam. But when you combine both prose and poetry, prose and verse, to tell the story, that's called champu. And Jiva Goswami tells Krishna's stories in this champu form. And so great is his accomplishment in terms of doing this, that Gopal Champu is regarded as the pinnacle of champu literature in Sanskrit. So when people study champu style literature, they see the Gopal Champu as the peak of that genre, of the best of that tradition. Before Jiva Goswami, champu was used in a very kind of shallow sort of way to glorify kings and things like that, but not with great literary intent. He really developed that genre into what it is, and wrote a book called Sadharana Champu Lakshana, where Jiva Goswami describes, it's a manual basically for how to write champu style of literature. So he created this guide for other people after him who might want to write in that style of literature. So that's the most famous of his literary works, of his poetic works, although there are others like Madhava Mahotsava and others that he does as well. And then, so you've got philosophical works, poetic works, and then he does also commentaries. On other people's works. So the most famous of this is the commentary on Nectar of Devotion, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. That commentary I've already mentioned. It's called Durgama Sangamani. But also you have his Krama Sandarbha, which is his commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam, and other such commentaries that he wrote. And the fourth and final category is manuals, manuals of how to learn and how to write. One of these I've already mentioned, the Champu Lakshana, on how to write Champu literature. But the most famous of Jiva Goswami's manuals is Harinamamrita Vyakarana, the grammar which gives the nectar of Krishna's holy names. This is a very special book because in most grammars, they follow Panini. Panini was the original grammarian. His grammar was so good that pretty much everyone after him learns Panini's grammar. It's called the Ashtadhyayi. But the thing about Panini's grammar is that to describe different grammatical forms, Panini uses these words or little bits of words that he creates himself. So one case, for example, he'll call lit, for example, or ling. And these are little phrases, little words that he creates to describe a particular grammatical case or grammatical form. But this creates sutras, grammatical sentences that are rather odd sounding and don't really have any meaning outside the grammatical context. And students in India, traditionally, when you're learning a Sanskrit grammar, will spend years memorizing the thousands of sutras of grammar, the thousands of grammatical rules that Panini provides. And from a Vaishnava perspective, from Jiva Goswami's perspective, this is so much wasted time. Not wasted, but time that could be used better, because you're memorizing all this grammatical knowledge and there's no Krishna in the picture. And so Jiva Goswami takes that grammar and he replaces all the rules. He simplifies it and he replaces the rules and grammatical cases with Krishna's names. So that when you get a grammatical rule in the Harinamamrita Vyakarana, every grammatical rule has two different meanings. One meaning is grammatical and the other is devotional. It makes theological sense as well. So that by the time you spend all those years memorizing these sutras, by the end of it, the goal is that you also become Krishna's devotee. So one little example I'll give you is the vowels. In Sanskrit, you have vowels and consonants that are nicely separated and organized. You have them in English as well, but they're all mixed together in the alphabet. But in Sanskrit, they're separated. And Jiva Goswami calls the vowels Sarveshwara, means the Lord of everything. That's Vishnu. And the consonants he calls Vishnu Jana, which means the devotees or the servants of Vishnu. So the vowels are Vishnu and the consonants are his servants. And the reason for that is because the definition of a vowel is something that can be pronounced independently. Just like I can say or I can say u, right? But a consonant is something that can only be pronounced with the help of a vowel. Like if you take the first consonant of the Sanskrit alphabet, which is a K, ka. So if I want to say it without a vowel, I would have to say, the sound doesn't come out. Nothing comes out. you have to say ka, and there's the right? The vowel is always there when you pronounce the consonant. That's why when we recite the English alphabet, we say A, then we say B, right? Now, B is not the sound. That's the name of the letter because we can't say it otherwise. The sound is B, you can't say that. You have to add the E, and the E is a vowel. So vowels are independent. Consonants depend on the vowels for their existence. Therefore, the vowels are Sarveshwara. They're the Lord of everything. They're Vishnu. And the consonants are Vishnu Jana, which means the devotees, the Vaishnavas, because the Vaishnavas are always dependent on Vishnu for their life. And so you can imagine whenever Jiva Goswami talks about vowels and consonants, it always leads to very beautiful theological, philosophical points and ideas that he conveys through his grammatical sequences. So it's a brilliant, wonderful grammar. And there's many other things I could say about it, but we will run out of time otherwise. So imagine commentaries, manuals, poetic works, and philosophical works. 4 different styles of literature, and the most that people do is 1 or 2, right? That's about as much as most people can manage. Jiva Goswami wrote 25 different major books in each, over these 4 different categories, right? That's how versatile he was and how vast his output was, his literary output. But not only did Jiva Goswami write a lot, he also, his writings were also very, very deep, right? It's not that he was writing novels, mystery novels with some, preconceived formula for how to do the plot. No, this is, each one of his books has so much depth in it that one could easily study any one of these works for a lifetime. And I'm very serious about that, not exaggerating at all. Just to give you my own example, when I was doing my PhD, Jiva Goswami wrote these 25 different works, right? And for my PhD, I focused on one of these works, which is the Shat Sandarbha, the Bhagavat Sandarbha, the 6 philosophical treatises that I was talking about earlier. And this Bhagavata Sandarbha has 6 parts to it, as I mentioned. And in my work, I focused on one of these 6 parts, the third one, called Paramatma Sandarbha. And Paramatma Sandarbha has 105 chapters or sections to it. And I focused on just one of these sections, the 105th one, the last one. And even of that, I didn't do the entire thing, right? And that was enough to get a PhD at Oxford University. So you can imagine how many PhDs can be produced just on the 6 Sandarbhas, what to speak of the writings of Jiva Goswami as a whole. Many of these works have not even been studied in the West, and very few people have studied them in India. So there's so much depth there. When Jiva Goswami writes, he is quoting people from all over the philosophical map. And he's assuming, one of the things I realized in the Sandarbhas is that Jiva Goswami was not writing for me, right? He was writing for a group of scholars and intellectuals that practically don't even exist today. When he writes, he often will, he'll quote, in his commentary on the first few sutras of the Vedanta Sutra, Jiva Goswami will quote the works of Ramanujacharya or Shankaracharya, and he won't actually quote them fully. He'll just refer to them, assuming that the reader already knows what he's talking about. I remember one particular passage where Jiva Goswami says that he's trying to prove a point, and he says that if we apply the method used by Shankaracharya in the second interpretation he gives of this particular sutra in Vedanta Sutra, if we use that method, our point is proved. And that's it. He moves on to the next point. That's the totality of the proof that he's making for this particular point. And I remember spending a good, full day's work, 6 to 8 hours of work, tracing what Jiva Goswami had just said. First of all, asking, okay, Shankaracharya's commentary in Vedanta Sutra, let's go look that up. On this particular sutra, what sutra is that? And what does that sutra say? We need to know that first. And then the second commentary, but Shankaracharya only wrote one commentary on the Vedanta Sutra called Sharirika Bhashya. But sure enough, for that sutra, I discovered Shankaracharya wrote 2 separate explanations, one after the other. So I looked at the second one, as Jiva Goswami did. And I thought, but here he's making a point that is Mayavadi, it's impersonalistic. Why would Jiva Goswami accept or use that? But then no, go back to what he said. And Jiva Goswami says, we are applying the method used by Shankaracharya, not the content, just his method of argument. So then I spent hours trying to figure out what is Shankaracharya's argument, what's his method there, and how he applies that method. And then took that method and applied it to the argument that Jiva Goswami was making in Paramatma Sandarbha, and the whole thing worked. It made complete sense. It created a footnote about that long in the book, but it worked. And all of that, Jiva Goswami just pulled out of a hat, as we say. It was an off-the-cuff, practically, remark for him, because he assumed his readers, even the Vaishnava ones, would be familiar enough with Shankaracharya's commentary that they'd be able to go, oh yeah, that sutra, of course, oh, the second commentary, oh, I get it. And maybe, a quick lookup in their reference on their shelf, let's look up the commentary, but not taking 8 hours of work like it took me. So what I mean to say is, Jiva Goswami is writing for an audience that is practically non-existent today. The types of scholars that were there, there's a few like that still, but not many. And this entire body of literature was at his fingertips. One of the characteristics of Jiva Goswami's Sanskrit style is that he uses a lot of abstract nouns. Like an abstract noun in English would be the condition of being a human is humanness, okay, or humanity. That would be an abstract noun built from the noun human. And Jiva Goswami, instead of saying, many times, instead of saying, for example, he is human, he would say, of him there is humanity, right? He has humanity. And this makes for some very complicated sentences. And I remember thinking, why is it so difficult? Why is he writing like this, using so many abstract nouns? And so I asked a senior graduate student of a colleague at Oxford who was much more learned about Sanskrit literature than I was. And I said, can you look at a piece of this, a sample of this writing, and tell me what style this is or what he's doing? And he looked at it and he said, oh, this is the style of Nyaya writing. This is how logicians, Indian logic, people in the field of Indian logic write. It's with these. In order to understand Jiva Goswami's writing properly, you're going to have to study Nyaya, Indian logic, better. And I thought, wow, this is too much. Instead of just Vedanta, which was what I was dealing with, this is a whole nother field of Nyaya that I have to look into. So I could give many examples, but this is all to say that Jiva Goswami's depth of learning, not just his breadth of writing, but the depth of his writings is incredible. It's really, really amazing. And this is why both Vaishnavas and secular scholars around the world have described Jiva Goswami's accomplishments in superlatives. I'm saying he's the greatest scholar of the Bhagavatam, one of India's greatest philosophers. I mean, this is the language that they use when they talk about Jiva Goswami. And it really should be a matter of pride for us as followers, as devotional descendants of Jiva Goswami, in his line, in his parampara, to have someone like this, someone who is a scholar of beyond compare in India's history, in the world's history. So this is Jiva Goswami's accomplishment in terms of his scholarship. But everything I've said is just one aspect of Jiva Goswami's glories and his contribution to Mahaprabhu's movement. The remaining aspects I want to tell you in just 15 minutes, okay, because we're running short on time and I want to leave some time for questions and discussion. But the one thing I want to tell you, well, a couple things, is that besides being a great scholar, Jiva Goswami was also a great leader of our movement. As in, he provided leadership and vision for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's movement. Remember, I told you that he was in the second generation, right? The time after Mahaprabhu's departure and the departure of most of Mahaprabhu's associates. And this is a very difficult time for any religious movement. When the charismatic leader and founder leaves, there's a challenge there in terms of how do we take the absence of that charisma? How do we handle the absence of the great charismatic figure who was the inspiration behind everything? And how do we channel that charisma into ways that it can be preserved for generations to come? So we see the turbulence that happens after the founder leaves in every religious tradition, whether we look at Christianity or Islam, we look at Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's movement, or we look at our own Iskcon movement. Right? There's so much challenge that is there that were emerging after Mahaprabhu's departure. Questions of what is exactly Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's nature, personality. Is he Krishna? Is he Srimati Radharani? Is he Lord Narayan? Is he an avatar? Is he the source of all avatars? Different discussions about how puja and worship should take place, how practically the movement should go on. And in all of these aspects, Jiva Goswami provided extraordinary leadership for the movement. Bhakti Ratnakar describes that Janava Devi, after Lord Nityananda Prabhu's departure, Janava Devi was Nityananda Prabhu's consort. And after Nityananda Prabhu's departure, Janava Devi took leadership of the movement in Bengal and guided the devotees there. And Bengal was the center of the movement in terms of the numbers of devotees and the spread and reach of our temples and the Sangha. But Janava Devi came more than once. Actually, she came once and she wrote multiple letters as well to Srila Jiva Goswami, discussing and asking for advice on how the movement should be run. Very practical matters on organization and things like that. Ramakanta Chakrabarti, a historian of Bengal, says that it was Srila Jiva Goswami who guided Narottam Das Thakur in starting the festivals, the first festival at Keturi that some of you may be familiar with, which brought together for the first time all of Gaudiya Vaishnavas and created that sense of community and began the worship of Mahaprabhu's deities, the Vigraha, the deity form of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. That this was guided, the strategy was discussed in consultation with Srila Jiva Goswami. He was very well aware of the need of bringing unity. And this is one of the reasons that he sent the books of the Goswamis. He edited them and sent them with his disciples, Shyamananda Pandit, Srinivasacharya, and Narottam Das Thakur, to Bengal, to create that philosophical unity so that any disagreements and doubts can be put to rest. And there's a combined sense and understanding. He is the one who helped guide Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, Chaitanya Charitamrita to conclusion, and again made it available to the Vaishnava community, where the Siddhanta, the final conclusion of Mahaprabhu's nature, is discussed as the combined form of Radha in Krishna. Radha Bhava Dyuti Suvalitam Naomi Krishna Swarupam. So Jiva Goswami had that vision of a leader, that we have to bring the movement together, create a sense of unity, philosophically, theologically, and also institutionally, create that unity for future generations. So the fact that Mahaprabhu's movement flourishes as a single movement with a shared understanding of who is Mahaprabhu, who is Krishna, this is we owe this to Srila Jiva Goswami. So he was a great scholar and a great leader. But in addition to that, and this is something very amazing, I think, he was also a very expert manager. And by manager, I mean someone who dealt with the day-to-day challenges and troubles of keeping an institution running and keeping people satisfied in their proper services. He was not simply an intellectual, so to speak, in the ivory tower. And we have a lot of historical evidence for this aspect of Jiva Goswami's character. From very early on, Jiva Goswamis took it as his mission to facilitate the senior Goswamis in Vrindavan in their service by taking care of all their material and legal and political and all sorts of other factors. When Raghunath Das Goswami, he wanted to spend his days, his life at the banks of Radhakund, and for that he needed a place. But the very thought of engaging in a business transaction for property, or for renting a place, or for getting it from someone, just the very thought of that was not very tasteful to him. We know Raghunath Das Goswami's character. He practically wanted and needed nothing for his survival. And yet, Srila Jiva Goswami took it as his service. He said, Raghunath Das Goswami needs this, and so he procured a little plot of land on the banks of Radhakund, where it still is today, for Raghunath Das Goswami to do his bhajan, and facilitated that for him. The temples of the six Goswamis, especially the Radha Govinda temple of Rupa Goswami, the Radha Govinda temple is one of the finest, if not the finest example of temple architecture from medieval India. And I say this not from just a position of faith, but just really, if you study the archaeology of India, the Radha Damodar temple is described as being unparalleled. We only have what remains of it today because the Mughals destroyed the upper stories. But it's extraordinary in terms of its structure, in terms of its carving, its stonework. But these temples were left by the Goswamis in the legal care of Jiva Goswami. And so we find that Sri Jiva worked with the political powers of his time to ensure that the legal title for these temples always remained in the hands of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas for generations to come. Let me explain. At that time in India, 16th century, India was at the peak of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is one of the most successful Islamic empires in the history of the world. And although it was an Islamic empire, not all of the rulers were against. In fact, many of them were not against Vaishnava Bhakti. They allowed it and sometimes even facilitated it. with a couple of very notable exceptions that we'll talk about. But here you have a political power that is not Vaishnava, not even Hindu, okay? And that political power is always unstable. The rulership in Delhi has been unstable in India for centuries, for thousands of years, okay, before the British arrived, always fighting with each other and different kings coming and sacking the place and coming back again. We know that about the instability in the 18th century in the time of Aurangzeb. So during Jiva Goswami's time, the ruler was Akbar in the 16th century. Okay? And he was a very open-minded ruler, very, very good one for Vaishnav devotees. But you couldn't count on every ruler being like that. Right? You just don't know. People come and go, and temples are always prime targets. Not just because of religious bigotry, but perhaps more importantly, because temples are places of wealth. This is where people give donations. This is where beautiful jewelry and woodwork and stonework is done for the deities. Right? These are centers of society and culture. This is where so much of every society invests its best riches in its religious places. If you look at the cathedrals of Europe, if you look at the mosques in the Middle East, and if you look at the temples of India. So whenever an army, a king in Delhi needed money for the treasury, what do? Well, come up with a reason for religious bigotry and to support the religion, whatever yours might be, and go and sack the closest temples. And Vrindavan is an easy target geographically. It's close to Delhi, about 90 miles away, the capital. And there's no mountains or major geographical roadblocks. It's open plains. You're in the plain of the Yamuna River. And open plains, easy for an army to run over. You sack the temples, destroy a few, but most importantly, take the wealth, and off you go. Your treasure, your coffers are full again. There's instability there. That's dangerous. And so Jiva Goswami's vision, his foresight, was how do we make sure that these temples are secured for the future? And so the only counterbalance to Mughal power in North India were the Rajputs. These were the kings of Rajasthan, who were such strong and powerful Hindu kings that the Mughals, beginning with Akbar, decided that better than trying to conquer them, like they did with the rest of India, or North India, it was easier to make alliances with them. Right? If you can't fight them, then you join them. And so they intermarried with the Rajputs, Akbar did, and they made friends with them. So the Rajputs in Rajasthan were the main advocates for Hindus in the court in Delhi. All this to explain to you what Jiva Goswami did. He worked with Raja Todarmal, which was one of the Rajput kings, one of the Rajput chiefs, and asked him to request the court in Delhi, Akbar, to give permanent legal ownership of the Radha Govinda temple, and with it the others, to the Goswamis of Vrindavan and their heirs, the heirs that they designate for the future. And so we have on record a farman, an edict from Akbar, the most famous of Mughal emperors, bequeathing the land and the temple of Radha Govinda to Jiva Goswami, whom he describes as a poor and worshipful man. He says, I give this to Jiva Goswami, a poor and worshipful man in Vrindavan. And Jiva Goswami did this with he acquired various plots of land for the temples and then worked to ensure that that property stayed in our name. The only reason today we all can go to Vrindavan and visit these holy places and see these beautiful temples is because of Jiva Goswami. We owe it to him. If it was not for him, there is no reason why these temples would not be destroyed to the ground in the way that, for example, the Keshavji temple in Mathura was destroyed to the ground by the Mughal armies, by Aurangzeb in particular. Because 200 years later, what we discussed came to pass. Aurangzeb, 18th century, was one of the most difficult and bigoted of the Mughal emperors, and decided to go on a campaign of destroying the temples of Vrindavan. Yes, he destroyed the top few floors of the Radha Govind temple because he just couldn't handle its beauty and its greatness and its power. But it's still standing today. And the Madan Mohan temple is still standing. When these armies come through, they are destructive, but they're not blind. They work according to some political rules, and the previous rulers' edicts and laws do carry weight in the future. So we owe Srila Jiva Goswami these land, these temples, they exist because he made the effort to do, quote unquote, the dirty work of doing all the legal stuff that no one likes to do, right? It would have been much easier only to write books and to do kirtan. But he decided, no, this is important for the future of our movement. And as the second generation of the movement, he thought to protect Mahaprabhu's movement is my responsibility. My predecessors, the Six Goswamis and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they gave us everything, and now it's my job to protect, to take care, to preserve for future generations. Srila Jiva Goswami also was the first person in India, as far as we know, on record, to write a will, of a final testament. These days, having your final testament, your will, is a very common thing, right? Any doctor will encourage you to have your living will. But Jiva Goswami wrote a living will centuries before this. And it was a very new piece of legal technology or legal instrument in India at that time. In fact, scholars, historians of India today study the will not for its spiritual value, but for an example of its legal implications in Indian history. He was using the latest legal instruments to ensure its protection. And that will is visible at the Vrindavan Research Institute. It's really amazing to see at the end the signatures of all these famous devotees that we hear about in Bhakti Ratnakar and other kathas. You see their signatures where they were testament to what needed to be done. In fact, it didn't just leave it at this, not just property, but he also ensured that each one of the temples had a pujari, a head priest who would take care of the deities after his departure. And he specified how the succession should go on after that. He left the worship of Shri Radha Damodar to one Gopal Das. And Jiva Goswami describes that in that will, he says, I pray to have the association of Gopal Das life after life. So dear was this devotee to him. So he ensured that the worship and that there was both property, there was money, and there were people who could take care of the temples of the Goswamis, and most importantly, take care of the deities, Shri Radha Govinda, Shri Radha Madan Mohan, Shri Radha Damodar, and so on. And he was willing to work with politicians. He was willing to work with whoever needed to be in order to make sure that this actually happened. So he was an extraordinary manager as well, a great scholar, a great leader and visionary, and a great manager as well. And the last thing, which I'll say just one word about because I've kind of already mentioned it, but he was also a very wonderful teacher. A Gaudiya Vaishnav acharyas from around India would send their students to him for learning. They were not directly his Diksha disciples, but everyone knew that Jiva Goswami was the best in terms of teaching Shastra. And so Srinivasa Acharya, Narottam Das Thakur, Shyamananda Pandit, none of them were initiated by Jiva Goswami. They were Diksha disciples of other spiritual masters, other Vaishnavas, but yet they learned from him the Shastra, the Vaishnava Shastras. And he empowered them to go to the east, to Bengal, to distribute the works of the Goswamis. And each one of them had such a significant impact in their areas of preaching. Shyamananda Pandit, for example, transformed all of Orissa, and his disciple, Rasikananda Thakur, Orissa and Assam as well. Narottam Das Thakur did amazing things in Bengal, and so on. So he was also an inspiring teacher who knew how to empower his own students, who prioritized the next generation after him and left the movement in very good hands. Not that he was so good and charismatic and after him everything ended because no one had the ability to take his place. No, he empowered the next generation and ensured that the movement continued after him as well. So think about that. Great scholar, great teacher, great manager, and great leader. These qualities don't come together in one person. I can tell you from my own experience, great scholars are often not great teachers. You can go to Harvard and Yale and study with the very, very best, the most brilliant Nobel laureates, but there's no guarantee they know how to convey their ideas in simple ways for the beginning student. You know, sometimes the best mridanga players don't know how they do their beats. They're so good. They don't know how to slow them down. And often the best teachers, they're not the greatest scholars because they invest their time and their heart in teaching, not in the production of new books and knowledge. And scholars, oh, for sure, they're not the best managers, right? It would be wonderful to find a scholar who could manage their own life, what to speak of institutions, right? Professors are famous for being absent-minded, right? A little bit of a stereotype, but still, there's something to it. And managers are often don't have the time or the desire to do great scholarship, right? So these qualities, they don't typically appear in one person at the same time. And yet there is one person we know who had all of these together. And we can end with a little bit of reflection on him, right? That's our own Srila Prabhupada. If we look at his life and his activities, he had these four things in extraordinary ways. As a great scholar, he translated Srimad Bhagavatam, all the most difficult of Sanskrit literature. That's a different topic. And with all the commentaries of the Vaishnavacharyas summarized in his purports, right? Volumes and volumes of books. And at the same time, he managed an international movement and society in such a way that it continues to flourish after his departure. He set up the structure for the future, just like Jiva Goswami did. And he was a wonderful leader, a visionary. He had the ability to take one person and put them in exactly the right spot, the best service for them. Even the person themselves didn't know that this was good for them. I can't do that. I can't run a magazine. I've never done that before. No, you can do it. I can't go to China to preach. No, you can do it. Right? And Prabhupada would empower people with that vision of leadership. And of course, he was a wonderful teacher. If you hear his morning walk conversations, the way he honed the skills of his students by debate and argument and playing the devil's advocate, corrected them and encouraged them just as much as needed. So we see in Srila Prabhupada something that could be topic of another lecture, these four qualities put together. And therefore, going back to the beginning of this talk, it is no coincidence that Srila Prabhupada spent his early years, received his inspiration at the Radha Damodar temple from Srila Jiva Goswami, that he had the shelter, the inspiration, the empowerment of Srila Jiva Goswami to start the Krishna consciousness movement and spread it all over the world. This is Srila Prabhupada's receiving direct empowerment from Jiva Goswami, exemplifying, embodying his qualities in our own times. And we can see someone of that wonderful character and personality. In fact, recently I gave a lecture on Srila Prabhupada's recording, his rendition, his singing of the Shad Goswami Ashtaka. So if you want a little bit more about the relationship, the mood, the relationship between the six Goswamis and Srila Prabhupada in the context of his devotion, this lecture I gave recently on the New Jersey channel for a Sunday feast class, you can refer to that. And for anyone who wants to hear more about the six Sandarbhas, there's a series of lectures I gave at Iskcon Silicon Valley under the title of Tattva Sandarbha, even though it's about multiple Sandarbhas. But you can get more there. So whether the devotional side or the philosophical side, there are more resources to follow up afterwards. But I'll end at this point just with this thought, that how much pride we should have in our heritage, in our history, that we have personalities like Srila Jiva Goswami and our own Srila Prabhupada, right, that accomplished so much, that provided such a wonderful example. Every quality can be used in Krishna's service, Prabhupada says, even pride. And this is the proper application of pride, not in our own egos, but pride in our history, in our heritage, that we are spiritual descendants of personalities like Srila Jiva Goswami. We may not, none of us have the capacity to fully understand his contribution. So we may not be able to understand every little detail, but we can certainly be proud of where we come from and who our spiritual ancestors are. Every child has a right to be proud of their ancestors. And as Srila Jiva Goswami's spiritual descendants and Srila Prabhupada's grandchildren, we have the right to be proud about them. And if there's anything that you take from today's class, I hope that that sense of joy and pride in Srila Jiva Goswami is something that you will keep with you. Thank you all so much for your time and your attention. I'm so sorry I went over time. There was just too much to say, but I hope there'll be at least a few minutes for interaction.
I can't thank you enough, Radhika Raman Prabhu. This was a truly amazing, diverse description of such a tremendous personality as Srila Jiva Goswami, and how you tied him back into Iskcon and connecting the second generation from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the challenges that we face in Iskcon today, and going through all the different intricacies of his scholarship, the 4 different types of writings that he did. I just thank you so much for giving us that understanding of Srila Jiva Goswami.
Thank you for the opportunity, Prabhu.
Real quick, I want to just recognize a couple devotees that are on with us. I don't think I got to them in the beginning. They may have joined right after we began. It's Lutumba Prabhu and Mother Rukmini are here with us. I'd like to welcome you. Vishnu Gada Prabhu and Kaivalya Prabhu are also with us. We'd like to welcome them and say Hare Krishna. I guess at this time we can open it up and have some questions and comments. The first one I would like to Vishnu Gada Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Radhika Raman Prabhu, Vishnu Gadadas. It was so great to see your excitement, absorption in Srila Jiva Goswami and conveyed it to us. It was wonderful. I had a question about, you mentioned that when Srila Jiva Goswami left home, he went to Benares to study first, and was there for a year, and he was studying the different systems of thought, darshans. So, usually we hear asat sanga tyaga e vaishnavachar. The devotees want to avoid associating with, non-devotees. So, do you have any information about how Jiva Goswami kind of maintained himself there in Benares? I mean, it's relevant also to devotees who go to school and stuff like that too.
Yes. So my obeisances to you, Prabhu. Thank you so much for attending and coming today. And thank you for this wonderful question. This is something that I've thought about a lot, simply because of my own history in terms of getting a secular education at the university and my career as a professor and so on. It's really a fine balance between as you said, asat sanga tyaga, giving up the association of non-devotees and those who are not favorable for the path of bhakti, and at the same time reaching out and taking what is useful and important and helpful for our own service. And I think the fundamental principle is that we have to associate with devotees, and we have to give up the association of those who are not favorable to bhakti. Srila Rupa Goswami makes this very clear in his Upadeshamrita and his Nectar of Instruction. And yet, we also can and in many cases must reach out to receive what is useful and helpful in terms of knowledge, in terms of mundane knowledge, right? The material world has many things in it, and many useful things also. And just like we would want to learn engineering to build a temple from an engineer, so we want to learn philosophy from someone who's a philosopher, who's the very best at what they do, right? But I think the key in terms of remaining safe as we do that, and remaining on the straight and narrow path of bhakti, is that we accept, we seek that which is useful for our seva, for our service. Knowledge, when sought for its own sake, becomes a roadblock, a danger, even poisonous for the path of bhakti. We know this very well from the writings of the Goswamis. But when that knowledge is useful for our service, if we accept knowledge to the extent that is useful for our seva, then it becomes a wonderful resource for bhakti. And it becomes an example of the principle of yukta vairagya, right? So just like for our housing, we should take what is only useful. No need for a Vaishnava to live in massive, massive accommodations and huge palaces. And yet, when such buildings are useful for Krishna's service, for example, to build a temple to receive guests and Vaishnavas and host them and so on, then such things can be accepted by a devotee. The same, I think, is true of knowledge as well, that the principle of atyahara, or over-collecting, is something that Rupa Goswami warns us against. And over-collecting knowledge is very much a danger. And so therefore, Srila Prabhupada explains in his purport that we have to accept these things only to the extent that they are useful to our bhakti. And that's something in terms of understanding our seva for the Lord. That's a lifetime's project in terms of understanding ourselves and seeking advice from those who are our seniors to understand, yes, this is my seva, this is what I need to do. And it changes over the course of a lifetime, what we need to know, how much we need to know, how we need to acquire that knowledge as well. But the key is, as we acquire that, to ask ourselves, what is useful for my seva? And secondly, as we acquire it, to always remain in the association of devotees. That, I think, is the most important, that having that sadhu sangha always, even when we are venturing into asat sangha, to have that sadhu sangha is so crucial. It keeps us on the straight and narrow path. And if those things are there, then sometimes this quote unquote mundane knowledge can be very useful. It can be engaged in Krishna's service very nicely as yukta vairagya. Sometimes in order to make an impact in the circles that we want to make an impact in, we have to first work our way into that circle, right? And so when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, for example, went to meet Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, then for 7 days, he listened patiently from Sarvabhauma, right? All kinds of impersonalistic ideas. And then finally, at the end of the 7th day, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya says, "You've listened so well, but you haven't said anything. Do you understand? Do you have something to say?" And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, "Well, actually, I did. I do have something to say." You know, and so it's sometimes, you know, that can become for me, that story of Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya and Mahaprabhu was a great inspiration and sort of a guiding story in terms of how we can navigate, how I could navigate such situations. In my case, it wasn't 7 days, it was 7 years of patiently listening, actually more than that, of just listening and listening and listening. And at the end, you get your PhD, and finally someone says, oh, do you have something to say as well about this topic? And you say, well, actually I do, and here's what I would like to say, right? So this is in the case of my own service, but there are many services like this, where we have to work our way in to make an impact, to make a difference, to represent Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in our circles, whether it be in academic ones or whether it be in communications or whether it be in any area. We have to work hard to work our way in, right? And the best way to do that is to always, as we're working our way in, to always stay closely packed up in the association of devotees. Otherwise, it can become very risky and challenging. So I hope that...
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhu.
We have another question from Krishna Kirtan, Prabhu.
Thank you, Radhika Raman, for very, very wonderful. And I have a mixed feeling that after hearing this, it is overwhelming sometimes to see, how I feel tiny in this moment. At the same time, as you mentioned, I feel so proud to be such a wonderful movement. It is unbelievable. Thank you so much for giving this insight. Only about Jiva Goswami so far, maybe in future you have to speak others. On the similar line, I had the same question what Vishnu Prabhu was asking. So it appears like at the early age, Jiva Goswami has, reached Banaras to study on this 6 darshans, right? Then he goes to study for the bhakti under Rupa and Sanatana Goswami. It appears like is it orchestrated his life, or he did under the guidance of someone. And I don't know, that's one of the things. Because you said that his primary appearance is also to establish the scholarly teachings of Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. Now that is one thing. And second, also, I'm adding second question also, because you mentioned because of his expert managerial skills, he protected the temples of Vrindavan. Even though they disfigured all these things, he protected. At the same time, I'm seeing that so many temples in India, I'm seeing that the Mughals has restored the temples and established the mosques on that. But in Vrindavan, we don't see this happen. Is because that is the reason it didn't happen? Just, I was curious.
Yeah, so in regard to your first question, first of all, your thought about humility, you feeling so small and yet feeling so proud. I think what you said is a very nice example of how both humility and pride can exist simultaneously in the heart of a devotee. We can be very humble about ourselves and very proud about Krishna and our acharyas. So that was a very nice point you made through your own expression. In regard to the Mughals, I mean, we can only guess. It's certainly I can say my guess that this is why those temples have not been destroyed to the ground, as I mentioned, many other temples have been, is because of the work that Jiva Goswami did. And of course, the acharyas after Srila Jiva Goswami also, in keeping up those relationships and maintaining those legal, arrangements. They put in so much work, but especially Jiva Goswami, I think you're right. I mean, this is one reason we can point to for why those temples still remain standing, even if they are slightly damaged or their height is reduced or something. They're still there, and we can still worship there. So they were very conscious of this, all our acharyas all the way through, beginning with Jiva Goswami. And this is why later on then in the 18th century, the temples are there, but the deities are moved to Rajasthan, right? So the temples were secure apparently, but the deities were too much of an easy target. And so they were moved to Rajasthan. And most of them are in Jaipur or in the surrounding areas today. So definitely that can be a reason. And what was your first question again, Prabhu?
The first question was because the way generally anyone practices bhakti, they follow the instructions of the acharyas or.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
So who he was working under? Yes.
Under, or is it like Lord Krishna has pre-planned that he made him? But he
Yes.
left at very early age, and he
Yes.
was. That's the anything on that.
Well, we don't know too much, but as I mentioned, Jiva Goswami received his initial guidance from Nityananda Prabhu. Bhaktivinoda Thakur tells us about that. And then immediately upon arrival in Vrindavan, he was under the wing of Rupa and Sanatan Goswami, who guided him, mentored him, trained him up.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have another question by Shamala Gopika Mataji.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, please accept my Dandavat Pranam. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Guru Maharaj. Thank you so much, Prabhu. As always, your lectures is amazing. I love the in-depth knowledge of each and everything that you are covering in every lecture. So today I like the very most important part, like when you're saying that many PhDs can come just in one part of Sandarbha, so many things. So it was so amazing to be proud of our acharyas. And so my, it's not a question, Prabhu, like I just want to hear the pastimes, like even though Jiva Goswami is a very scholarly person, but how he reacted in a very humble way, that some conversation or between the Rupa Goswami, Sanatan Goswami, Jiva Goswami. So some pastimes, I just want to hear it.
Yes. So wonderful question. Thank you for your appreciation, first of all. We don't know a lot of specific pastimes of Jiva Goswami for the reason I described, that there's no comprehensive biography of him. Actually, Shitala Mataji is in the process of writing a biography of Jiva Goswami, and we're very much looking forward to that. She's the one who wrote the biography of Narottam Das Thakur. Such a beautiful, powerful work. So we're very much looking forward to that, where she'll bring together all the little pieces and bits of knowledge that we have about Jiva Goswami's life. So not a lot of specific stories, kathas that I can tell, but one that Srila Prabhupada does tell is when Vallabhacharya visits Rupa Goswami, and Rupa Goswami receives him with so much care and respect, and really as a Vaishnav should for another senior Vaishnav. And then he asks him, please, I will be benefited if you hear my Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and give me some critical comments. So Vallabhacharya listens, and in the process of hearing, he gives him one little correction. He says, you have described the desire for mukti, you have described as a witch in the heart of a devotee. And I think that is a little too harsh of a description for mukti. After all, moksha is a good thing, no? So Rupa Goswami immediately took it to heart and said, I will make an adjustment. Jiva Goswami at that time was present, fanning Rupa Goswami and serving him. But in his heart, he was very upset about how Vallabhacharya could bring up this criticism for his guru. And so he followed Vallabhacharya, not followed, he went to the bank of the Yamuna to assist him when it came time for his noon bath before Prasad. And as he was coming out from his bath, he said, if I may submit a humble suggestion. And he said, yes, of course, I've heard many wonderful things about the young Jiva. I want to hear from you also. And Jiva Goswami says, actually what Rupa Goswami said is not that liberation is a witch. He said, mukti spriha pishachi. The desire for mukti is a witch. It's the desire that is the witch, not mukti. Any desire other than the desire for bhakti becomes like a witch in the heart of the devotee. And immediately he was so happy, Vallabhacharya. He went to Rupa Goswami and began praising Jiva effusively, saying, your student is so brilliant, I can see. And as soon as Vallabhacharya left, Rupa Goswami was so upset with Jiva Goswami. And he said, how someone like you is not qualified to be resident in Vrindavan. you should leave immediately, because you have demonstrated pride, the inability. Here was a wonderful Vaishnav who was trying to help me with his generous heart. He was trying to help me, and you've pushed him away. You've rejected his suggestion, and now I cannot benefit. He said, this is a sign of your arrogance. You should go, leave Vrindavan immediately. And there were many possible responses that Jiva Goswami could have made at this point. Like, number one, the scriptures say you should not remain silent when the guru or Krishna is being criticized. Right? That's the only time you should speak up. Right? And he wasn't even angry. He was just humbly offering a suggestion. So he could have said, look, I wasn't angry. I was just trying to explain. Right? He could have defended himself in many ways. Today we might say, you're overreacting. This is too much. But he displayed his humility and immediately left Vrindavan and went to Mathura and stayed at Nandaghat, where he did so much tapasya and austerity until the villagers saw him and found him, and eventually word got back to Sanatan Goswami. And Sanatan Goswami was the senior most of the Goswamis. And the role of the senior is always to be kind and compassionate to everyone in the family and to bring people together and help them. And so he was famous like that, Sanatan Goswami. And so he came to Rupa and he said, my dear Rupa, I have discovered that you are not following one of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's instructions. And Rupa Goswami said, really? This is terrible. Tell me what am I not doing? I must do it. And he said, no, you recite the instructions, I will tell you. And when he came to this line of, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, Jive Daya Krishna Nam Sarva Dharma Sar. The essence of all religion is Krishna's holy names and compassion to the living entities. Jive Daya. But here he said, that's the one. And Rupa Goswami began smiling. He said, yes, I understand. It was a pun, of course. Jiva in this case referring to Jiva Goswami. And he says, yes, we should bring him back. And so he lovingly brought him back to Vrindavan in his association. Prabhupada explains that everyone in this story was acting perfectly, including Jiva Goswami. Right? Rupa Goswami was showing how a spiritual master should correct a disciple and instill humility within him. Jiva Goswami showed how we should be willing to explain and defend our spiritual master, and how we should be willing to show humility and accept when something is offered for our own improvement. Right? And Sanatan Goswami showed the perfect role of the compassionate Vaishnava and the compassionate elder in terms of bringing everyone together when things were separated. So everyone played just the perfect role in this story, demonstrating their good qualities. So that's one story that I can remember and tell.
Thank you.
Very sweet. Thank you, Prabhu. We have two more hands up. Mother Nilambari Radhika Mataji. Okay, maybe we'll come back to you. We have Rajaras Prabhu. Unmute yourself.
Krishna Prabhu, Radhika Raman Prabhu, thank you so much for such a wonderful class on Jiva Goswami. And I was having a small doubt. You told that he wrote a commentary on Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu and you named it. I just wanted the name.
Yes, it's Durgama
Yeah.
Sangamani. Sangamani.
Sangamani.
So like Sangha and then Mani, like that.
Oh, one more question quickly. Like I was trying to reflect the learnings which you have got from Jiva Goswami. Like he was a very excellent leader and manager. So I was just thinking, that Nityanand Prabhu sent him to Vrindavan, and then he has been into so many, wherever he went, he learned, and he had so many teachers and so many mentors and counselors. And now in this Iskcon world, we have as we grow in bhakti, so we pass through such situation where we have in a few years we have certain counselors, then we have change of service authorities and change of locations and all those things. So I was thinking that how to maintain a balance and how we can, how to manage this, that we can be in touch with everyone, or like, should we just focus on where we are, or, it's like a situation where we want that, we have to be in touch with the devotees we were with or the counselors we were with, and now we are in a situation where we have a complete new area to be experienced and explore and make new relationships, new friendships, new teachers. So how do we train our mind or train ourselves, or how do we train our bhakti that yes, this is what I should be managing it like, so it's like more on the level of understanding relationships or something like that.
So it's a wonderful question, Prabhu, a very thoughtful one. My Guru Maharaj, Hanumat Preshaka Swami, he describes, he talks about how the residents of Vrindavan, they all, they live in Vrindavan at 3 different levels. First of all, every gopi, every cowherd boy is a good citizen in Nanda Maharaj's kingdom. Okay? They do their duties, they pay their taxes, they do their seva, they maintain good relationships with everyone. Right? Secondly, every Brajvasi has a circle of like-minded devotees with whom they share a similar service and to whom they can reveal their mind and something about their relationship with Krishna, revealing Guhyama Khyati Prichati. And finally, every gopi has an individual, personal relationship with Krishna that is unique to who they are as devotees, that no one else has. It's a personal, individual relationship with Krishna. And that's the foundation of everything, right? That's the source of all their inspiration and all their joy. In the same way, he says in Iskcon, we have to have, each one of us should have these 3 types of relationship. First, we should be a good citizen of Iskcon. That means we work under the direction of our superiors, our mentors, our temple president, our GBC. We perform our duties very nicely, right? Keep those good relationships. And then within that Iskcon, we should have a circle of devotees who we can genuinely call friends, that are not the Facebook friend variety, but really the Guhyama Khyati Prichati variety of friends, where we can reveal our heart and our mind to, and persons who can not only encourage us, but also tell us when we do something wrong, when something goes wrong, right? And we can trust them, because these are not people who are always out to get us, always out to undermine us. We know these people are genuine well-wishers, and they encourage us. They encourage us at times. So when they give us some correction, we can take it seriously, right? We know this is something we have to work on. So a real group of friends, of like-minded devotees. And finally, each one of us has to have an individual personal relationship with Srila Prabhupada. Right? This is the foundation of why we remain and we serve and we flourish in Iskcon. If you see all the devotees who have flourished despite thick and thin and ups and downs and movement and changes, as you're saying, from one part of the world to another, and shifts, and it's all through all those movements and changes, they have flourished, they have stayed, because they have this very strong, irrevocable relationship with Srila Prabhupada and dedication to him, a relationship that is born through his books, through his Vani, through his lectures and classes, right? So if we're functioning at these 3 levels, then we can be happy, right? We can be good in our situation. So we always have to ask ourselves, do we have all 3? There shouldn't be, as soon as there's a weakness in one of the 3, then things become really disturbing, right? So our managerial situation isn't clear, we become disturbed. We lose our connection with our friends, or we don't have that circle where we can reveal our mind, we become very lonely, right? And of course, if that personal relationship with Prabhupada is not there, and we're in Iskcon just for social reasons, it's not going to last, right? So we have to see, and sometimes, you know, there can be some little weakness in one of the three, and so we have to then shore it up, support it again in our practice.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Prabhu. It was a wonderful, clear answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's the end of the questions that we have right now. What a tremendous, hold on, I got a couple messages. Let me see if any of the messages had any questions.
Yeah, I have
appreciations.
I had plenty of questions actually. Can I go ahead with this?
Well, I mean, we're starting to get a little bit, you know.
Maybe one more.
Okay, and then we'll end on this one. And then,
yeah. You mentioned about Jiva Goswami's writing, and he wrote for a particular class of people, group of people who can understand, and that time to defend certain things, right? Now, in relationship to that, also you mentioned that Prabhupada also did the same similar thing, and he wrote things in such a way that people in this time, plus circumstances, and expertly he presented everything. My question was, as the time goes, the way it seems like from 500 back and now, the intellect of the people is going down, mandas mandamate, right? So now we see that Prabhupada is presented. Now we are working on 10,000 years. So is it, I'm saying it's going to be further degrading. In our whole life, we are seeing how our intelligence and everything is degrading. So are we expecting that further Acharya will come, something will present again, you know, based on the time, place, circumstances? Just hope, you know, if 500 is back now and next 1,000 years, something like that. Any thought on this? Or?
Yes. So Srila Jiva Goswami has given us everything we need, right, for centuries to come. Srila Prabhupada has given us everything we need for centuries to come. But it is our job as their followers, as their servants, to take what they have given and make it suitable and applicable for the understanding of our own generation and our own audience. Not just the intellectuals. Every audience needs to receive Mahaprabhu's message. They need to receive the beauty of Krishna consciousness, whether it's the intellectuals and the scholars, or it's the artistic community, or it's the culinary community, or it's the, you know, children, students, the elderly, the interfaith world, persons of other religions, persons of the Hindu faith, everyone. And it's our job to take what we have received and find a way to make it as suitable as possible for the audience to whom we want to present. Right? That's the responsibility of the student or the disciple. And I think this is a very good note to end on, because in Srila Jiva Goswami's life and his story, we can see an exemplar for so many different services, for sevas. Of course, for scholars and intellectuals, but also for temple presidents and managers and leaders and GBCs. Also for those engaged in communication seva, in the way that he worked with the various places of power and influence during his time. For those who work in legal sevas, legal services, he can provide such a wonderful example. For those who are pujaris and do deity worship, Jiva Goswami concern and arrangement for the worship of so many deities in Vrindavan and his personal service to Shri Shri Radha Damodar is an example worth following. For those who are inspired by book distribution, Jiva Goswami sent out the first book distribution party, so to speak, in taking the books of the Goswamis and taking them to Bengal, and from there to everywhere as they were copied and eventually published. Right? So for book distributors, for lawyers, for communicators, for scholars, for those engaged in interfaith work, Jiva Goswami, if you read his writings, he's drawing the best from a variety of different schools of thought, even those that are typically against the Vaishnava principles. He quotes approvingly from Shankaracharya in certain places where Shankaracharya's points he appreciates, he takes them. He doesn't mind, right? He takes the best from everywhere that he can find and uses it, employs it to glorify Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and to glorify Krishna. So whatever may be our source of inspiration in our seva, Jiva Goswami provides an example for how that can be done in a way that is creative and adaptive, at the same time very loyal and faithful to the Siddhanta as we receive it from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through the Parampara and through our own Srila Prabhupada. So with that, I think we can conclude today. We're, I think, about 30 minutes over time. Thank you so much, everyone, for your attention and especially for your wonderful questions. It was really a pleasure. It's really, I'm grateful for this opportunity to glorify Srila Jiva Goswami on his appearance day, and especially to Iskcon Philadelphia and to Dronacharya Prabhu for arranging it today. And my obeisances to all the senior Vaishnavas, Anuttama Prabhu, Rukmini Prabhu, and Vishnu Gada Prabhu, and all the others, senior Vaishnavas who are present on today's call. And to all my hearers, my obeisances and my gratitude. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. And our gratitude to you, Radhika Raman Prabhu. You made an exception to be with us here tonight. We know that your schedule for any other reason probably would have prevented you from joining us. But you made an exception to be with us to glorify Srila Jiva Goswami. You've taken the time to research, study, learn, and you've passed that information on to us. And for that, we are much better and more attached to Srila Jiva Goswami. I'm hoping once your schedule thins out a little bit, you can return and maybe we can glorify some more of the Six Goswamis and other Vaishnavacharyas. Thank you again so much. We wish you well in your endeavors, your devotional services that you're doing to educate the Vaishnava community and the communities outside of the Vaishnava circles. Also for you and your family, please stay well during this pandemic, remain healthy so you can continue to serve so nicely in Srila Prabhupada's service.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you so much for your good wishes. I appreciate it.
Hare Krishna. Tomorrow, I just want to make a quick announcement. Tomorrow we'll be celebrating another Vaishnavacharya. We have Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. It's his appearance day. So tomorrow is a fast until noon. I'm sure we're at the different temples that are represented here. There'll be classes and glorifications of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Here at Iskcon Philadelphia, we are blessed to have His Grace Anuttama Prabhu. He'll be speaking on the glories of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur tomorrow evening at 4:30 on this same Zoom channel. It also can be seen on the YouTube channel for Iskcon Philadelphia. So please join us for Anuttama Prabhu. And the mercy doesn't stop, because on Monday it is the disappearance day of Srila Haridas Thakur, the Namacharya. And then on Tuesday, it is the special day of Bhadra Purnima, where the mercy of Srimad Bhagavatam is available. One who gifts, it's stated that one who, in the Bhagavatam, that one who gifts the Bhagavatam to another devotee on a golden throne, that his destination is secured to go back to Godhead. So these next couple days are full of mercy. And again, Radhika Raman Prabhu, we are extremely grateful to you for sharing the mercy of Srila Jiva Goswami to us.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Srila Jiva Goswami ki jai.
Jai.
Ki jai.
Jai.
Radhika Raman Prabhu ki jai. Srila
Jai.
Prabhupada.
Jai.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Devotees, if you want to say, turn on your cameras and say Hare Krishna as we depart.
Haribo.
Haribo.
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Jai Prabhupada.
Haribo. Thank you so much. Radhika Raman Prabhu.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.